2 a.m., April 18, 1944. Le Mans, occupied France. Captain Etienne Moreau pressed himself flat against the cold ground, the stolen Wehrmacht work overalls smelling of German cigarette smoke and diesel fuel. 20 meters ahead, through the darkness, he could see the perimeter fence of the fuel depot, 3 meters of chain link topped with barbed wire, illuminated every 30 seconds by the sweep of a guard tower searchlight. Behind him, invisible in the shadows, waited 12 French Maquis fighters and 2 British SOE agents. 14 men carrying wire cutters, phosphorus grenades, improvised explosive devices built from wristwatches and fuse wire, and forged German identification papers. 14 men about to attempt something that seemed insane: walk into a heavily guarded German fuel depot and destroy 5,000 barrels of aviation gasoline. Moreau's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth was dry despite the cold April air. His hands that had been steady through 2 years of resistance operations, were shaking slightly as he gripped the wire cutters. He could see the guard in the tower, silhouetted against the faint glow of Le Mans in the distance. The guard was smoking, the orange ember of his cigarette visible each time he brought it to his lips. That small act of human weakness, the distraction of a cigarette, the momentary inattention, was what Moreau was counting on. The fuel depot spread across 3 acres of what had been farmland before the Germans requisitioned it in 1940. Intelligence reports indicated approximately 5,000 barrels of high-octane aviation fuel stored in rows under camouflage netting. This was fuel meant for Luftwaffe fighters and bombers operating from airfields across northern France. Fuel that would keep German aircraft in the sky when the Allied invasion came. Fuel that, if destroyed tonight, would leave German pilots grounded and helpless. But first, Moreau had to get his team through that fence without being spotted. Then they had to cross 50 meters of open ground to reach the storage area. Then they had to plant explosives and ignition devices on fuel barrels while German guards patrolled the depot. Then they had to escape before the explosives detonated and turned 3 acres of farmland into an inferno that would be visible 20 miles away. The searchlight completed its sweep, moving away from their position. Moreau had counted 28 seconds of darkness before it came back. 28 seconds to cut through chain-link fence without making noise that would alert the guards. He signaled to the man beside him, Jean-Paul, a mechanic from Lyon who'd joined the resistance after his brother was shot by the Gestapo. Jean-Paul moved forward in a crouch, wire cutters in hand, moving with the careful silence of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. The searchlight swept past. 28 seconds. Jean-Paul began cutting. The quiet snip of metal links parting sounded impossibly loud in the night silence. Moreau watched the guard tower, watched for any sign that the sound had been heard. The guard was still smoking, still looking out over the depot rather than down at the perimeter. 10 seconds. Jean-Paul cut faster. 20 seconds. The opening was almost large enough. 25 seconds. Jean-Paul pulled the cut section of fence aside, creating a gap barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. The searchlight began its return sweep. Jean-Paul flattened himself against the ground. Moreau held his breath. The light passed over them, illuminating the grass where they lay, making their shadows stretch long and dark. But the guard saw nothing, just empty ground, another routine sweep of an area that had never been attacked, that the Germans considered secure. Moreau crawled through the gap in the fence, then Jean-Paul, then the others, one by one, slipping through into the depot perimeter like shadows, like ghosts, like the night raiders they had become. Inside the fence, Moreau could smell the fuel. Heavy, cloying, the distinctive odor of aviation gasoline, thousands of gallons of it, stored in barrels stacked 3 high. One spark, one flame, and this entire depot would become a firestorm. That was exactly what Moreau intended to create. But they had to be careful. Plant the devices, set the timers, and be far away when the fuel ignited. Because once those barrels went up, there would be no escape. The heat would be intense enough to melt steel, to turn anyone within 100 meters into ash. Moreau checked his watch. 2:07 a.m. They had until 3:30 to complete the operation and clear the area. 93 minutes to destroy years of German fuel stockpiling. 93 minutes to strike a blow that might save thousands of Allied lives when the invasion came. He signaled his team forward. 14 men moved through the darkness toward 5,000 barrels of fuel. And in 2 hours, this depot, this critical piece of Hitler's war machine, would cease to exist. If this opening has you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now. This is one of the most daring sabotage operations of WWII that most people have never heard about. Drop a comment on where you're watching from. To understand why 14 men would risk their lives to destroy a fuel depot outside Le Mans, you need to understand what fuel meant to the German war machine in 1944, and why Allied commanders were obsessed with denying it to them. Modern warfare runs on petroleum. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, ships, all of them utterly dependent on gasoline or diesel to function. Without fuel, the most powerful military in the world becomes a static force, incapable of movement, unable to respond to threats or exploit opportunities. The German Wehrmacht understood this absolutely. Their entire doctrine of blitzkrieg, lightning war, depended on rapid mechanized movement powered by petroleum products. By 1944, Germany's fuel situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Allied bombing had destroyed many of Germany's synthetic fuel plants. Romania's Ploști oil fields, Germany's primary natural petroleum source, were under constant air attack and would soon be lost to Soviet advances. The fuel that kept German panzers rolling and Luftwaffe fighters flying was increasingly precious, increasingly scarce. This scarcity meant that fuel depots in occupied territories became critical strategic assets. The Germans couldn't afford to lose them. Every barrel destroyed was a barrel that couldn't power a tank rushing to repel the Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming. Every gallon of aviation fuel that went up in flames was fuel that couldn't keep. Luftwaffe aircraft in the sky to contest Allied air. Superiority, Allied intelligence. Services, particularly the British Special Operations, Executive, SOE, and American Office of Strategic Services. OSS had identified fuel depots as priority, targets for sabotage operations. Reports from occupied France highlighted vulnerable storage sites at Lyon, Le Mans, Rouen, and other locations where the Germans stockpiled fuel for military operations. These depots were connected to rail networks that brought fuel from Germany and distributed it to Wehrmacht units across France. Destroying these depots would accomplish several strategic objectives. First, and most obviously, it would deny fuel to German forces, reducing their operational capability. Second, it would force the Germans to divert resources to guard remaining depots and repair damaged infrastructure, pulling personnel away from other defensive duties. Third, it would demonstrate that the resistance was capable of striking significant blows against the occupation, boosting civilian morale and encouraging further acts of sabotage. But attacking these depots was extraordinarily dangerous. They were heavily guarded, with Wehrmacht soldiers, guard dogs, searchlights, and regular patrols. The depots themselves were deadly. One stray spark near fuel barrels could cause catastrophic explosions. And the German response to sabotage had become increasingly brutal. After previous resistance operations, the Gestapo had executed not just captured saboteurs, but also their families and random civilians as reprisals. The men and women of the French resistance knew these risks intimately. They'd seen friends arrested, tortured, executed. They'd witnessed reprisals that killed innocent people. But they continued fighting because the alternative, passive acceptance of Nazi occupation, was unbearable. This kind of courage under impossible circumstances is incredible. If you're appreciating this deep dive into resistance operations, give this video a like and let us know in the comments what other WWII stories you want to hear. The French resistance wasn't a single organization but a collection of networks, cells, and movements united by opposition to German occupation. Among the most effective were the Maquis, rural guerrilla fighters who operated from hidden bases in forests and mountains, launching hit-and-run attacks against German forces and infrastructure. The word maquis came from the Corsican term for dense Mediterranean shrubland, terrain perfect for hiding. By 1943, maquis groups had formed across France, particularly in regions like the Massif Central, the Alps, and the forests of the Northwest. These groups included escaped POWs, young men avoiding forced labor conscription to Germany, communists, Jews fleeing persecution, and ordinary French citizens who could no longer tolerate occupation. Life in the maquis was harsh. Members lived in makeshift camps, often in caves or forest clearings, constantly moving to avoid German sweep operations. Food was scarce, supplied by sympathetic farmers who risked death if caught helping the resistance. Medical care was primitive. Casualties from combat, accidents, or disease were common, and the threat of betrayal was constant. The Gestapo paid informants well, and one traitor could destroy an entire network. But the maquis possessed advantages that made them formidable despite their limited resources. They knew the terrain intimately, could disappear into forests and mountains that German soldiers unfamiliar with the region couldn't navigate. They had local support, civilians who provided food, shelter, and intelligence about German movements. And increasingly, they received support from Allied special operations units that dropped weapons, explosives, and trained agents by parachute. Captain Etienne Moreau had been involved with the resistance since 1941. Before the war, he'd been a civil engineer working on bridge construction and railway projects across France. When Germany invaded in 1940, Moreau was serving as a reserve officer in the French army. After France's defeat and armistice, he'd been demobilized like millions of other French soldiers and told to return to civilian life. For a year, Moreau tried to live normally under occupation. He returned to engineering work, now under German supervision since all major infrastructure projects were controlled by the occupation authorities. He watched German soldiers parade through French streets, watched collaborationists profit from working with the enemy, watched as Jewish neighbors disappeared in the night raids that would eventually send them to concentration camps. In early 1942, Moreau made his decision. He couldn't continue as if nothing had changed. He made contact with the resistance network operating in his region and began his double life, civil engineer by day, saboteur by night. His engineering knowledge made him invaluable. He understood infrastructure, could read technical drawings, knew how bridges and railways and buildings were constructed, and therefore how they could be destroyed most effectively. His first operations were small, cutting telephone lines, sabotaging German vehicles, helping Allied airmen who'd been shot down to evade capture. But as the resistance grew more organized and better supplied, the operations became more ambitious. Bridge demolitions, railway sabotage, ambushes of German convoys. And by 1944, with the Allied invasion looming, major sabotage operations against strategic targets like fuel depots. Moreau's maquis cell operated from bases in the forests south of Le Mans. The group included mechanics, farmers, teachers, students, ordinary people transformed by occupation into guerrilla fighters. They were supplemented by 2 British SOE agents, parachuted into France to provide training, coordinate with London, and participate in major operations. The SOE, Special Operations Executive, was Winston Churchill's instrument for setting Europe ablaze through sabotage, subversion, and support for resistance movements. SOE agents underwent intensive training in England before being dropped into occupied territory. They learned demolitions, silent killing techniques, how to operate radios and ciphers, how to organize and lead resistance cells. Many spoke fluent French and could pass as natives. Some were French nationals who'd escaped to England and volunteered to return as agents. The SOE's operations were some of the most dangerous missions of the war. If this combination of resistance fighters and Allied agents fascinates you, subscribe to see more stories about special operations that changed history. The 2 SOE agents working with Moreau's cell were Captain James Crawford and Lieutenant Pierre Beaumont. Crawford was British, a former Army officer who'd served in North Africa before volunteering for SOE. He was 32, spoke excellent French with a slight accent he claimed was from Normandy, and specialized in explosives and sabotage. Beaumont was French-Canadian, 26 years old, who'd grown up speaking French at home in Quebec before joining the Canadian Army. His French was native level, making him virtually undetectable as a foreign agent. Both men had parachuted into France in January 1944, carrying radio equipment, explosives, and instructions from London about priority targets. They'd linked up with Moreau's Maquis cell and spent 3 months training the fighters in advanced sabotage techniques, coordinating supply drops from RAF aircraft, and planning operations. The Le Mans fuel depot had been identified as a priority target by SOE headquarters in London. Intelligence reports indicated it stored massive quantities of aviation fuel intended for Luftwaffe units defending against the expected invasion. Destroying it would significantly degrade German air capability in the critical region where the invasion would occur. But the depot was heavily guarded, located near a German garrison, and surrounded by open ground that made approach difficult. Planning the operation took weeks. Moreau and Crawford spent days observing the depot from concealed positions, noting guard schedules, patrol patterns, and routines. They recruited sympathetic French workers who had access to the depot for maintenance or deliveries, obtaining detailed information about internal layout, barrel arrangements, and security procedures. The plan that emerged was audacious to the point of recklessness. Rather than attacking from outside with mortars or attempting to shoot their way in, they would infiltrate the depot disguised as German workers. Several resistance members had obtained Wehrmacht work overalls, the gray-blue coveralls worn by German support personnel. Others had stolen or forged German identity papers. The idea was to approach the depot during the shift change at 2 a.m. when security was momentarily relaxed, cut through the fence and move into the fuel storage area as if they belonged there. Once inside, they would plant phosphorus grenades and improvised explosive devices among the fuel barrels. The devices used timers made from wristwatches, the kind of simple but effective improvisation that SOE training taught. Set properly, they would detonate simultaneously at 3:30 a.m., after the saboteurs had withdrawn to safe distance. The phosphorus would ignite the fuel, and the resulting inferno would destroy the entire depot. The risks were obvious and terrifying. If discovered during infiltration, they would be killed in a firefight with guards who outnumbered them significantly. If the explosives detonated prematurely, they would be incinerated. If captured alive, they would face torture by the Gestapo and execution. Not just them, but potentially their families and members of their resistance cells. The Germans had made it clear that sabotage of military infrastructure would be met with massive reprisals. But the strategic importance of the target and the potential impact on the coming invasion made the risk acceptable to Moreau and his team. This was what they'd been fighting for since 1940, the chance to strike a meaningful blow against the occupation, to contribute to France's liberation in a tangible way. On the night of April 17, 1944, the team assembled at a farm 3 kilometers from the depot. They'd spent the day resting and preparing, checking equipment, reviewing the plan one final time. Each man knew his role. Moreau would lead the infiltration. Crawford would place the main explosive charges. Beaumont would coordinate timing and ensure everyone withdrew safely. The 12 Maquis fighters would provide as security, plant the ignition devices, and help carry the 20 kilograms of plastic explosive that Crawford had brought. As darkness fell, they dressed in their German overalls, checked their forged papers, and loaded the explosives and ignition devices into canvas bags designed to look like toolkits. They looked the part, tired German workers finishing a late shift at the depot. The uniforms were authentic, stolen from German facilities or taken from prisoners. The papers were good enough to pass cursory inspection, though not detailed examination. At 1:30 a.m. they began their approach. Moving in small groups to avoid attention, they converged on the depot from different directions. By 2:00 a.m., all 14 men were in position outside the perimeter fence, waiting for the moment when Moreau would signal to begin cutting through. We're approaching the moment of truth, when planning meets reality. Make sure you're subscribed because Part 2 will reveal whether Operation Black Knight succeeded and the devastating impact it had on German forces. The fence cutting took 4 minutes of breathless tension, but they made it through without detection. Now they were inside the perimeter, crouched in the darkness between the fence and the first row of fuel barrels. The searchlight continued its mechanical sweep. Guards moved along predictable routes. The depot's routine continued, unaware that 14 saboteurs were crawling through the shadows. Moreau gestured to his team, pointing out positions. They split into 4 groups, each responsible for a section of the fuel storage area. The plan called for each group to place multiple ignition devices. 3 or 4 phosphorus grenades attached to fuel barrels with improvised timers that would trigger them simultaneously. The plastic explosive would be concentrated on the main storage tanks, where a properly placed charge would rupture them and release thousands of gallons of fuel to feed the fire. Moving between the barrel rows required excruciating patience. They had to avoid making noise, avoid being caught in the searchlight beams, and avoid the German guards who patrolled through the storage area on unpredictable schedules. One Maquis fighter, moving too quickly, knocked against a barrel that shifted with a loud scraping sound. Everyone froze. A guard shouted a challenge demanding to know who was there. Beaumont, thinking rapidly, shouted back in German, "Barrel inspection. Everything is secure." His accent was perfect, his tone bored and annoyed at being questioned. The guard, hearing what sounded like a fellow German worker doing routine work, accepted the explanation and moved on. The near discovery sent adrenaline surging through every man. But they continued. This was too important to abort now. They'd come too far, risked too much. Either they completed the operation or they failed. But they wouldn't retreat without trying. Crawford reached the main storage tanks, massive cylindrical steel containers, each holding thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. He placed plastic explosive charges on the tank supports, using timers set for 3:30 a.m. The explosive amount was carefully calculated, enough to rupture the tanks and release their contents, but not so much that the blast would kill anyone still in the vicinity if something went wrong with the withdrawal. The Maquis fighters placed their phosphorus grenades. These devices were crude but effective, glass containers filled with white phosphorus, which ignites spontaneously when exposed to air. Each grenade was attached to a fuel barrel with wire, positioned so that when it detonated, molten phosphorus would spray across the barrels and ignite the gasoline. A small timer mechanism, built from wristwatch parts and wire, would break the glass at the designated time. By 2:45 a.m., all charges were placed. 14 devices scattered across the fuel depot, each timed to detonate at 3:30. The team began their withdrawal, moving back toward the fence gap they'd cut, staying low, moving slowly to avoid detection. A German guard walked past Moreau's position, close enough that Moreau could have reached out and touched him. The guard was smoking another cigarette, muttering to himself about the cold and the boredom of night duty. He had no idea that the man crouched 3 meters away was a French resistance fighter who'd just planted enough explosives to destroy the entire depot. The guard moved on. Moreau waited until he was out of sight, then continued toward the fence. One by one, the team members slipped back through the gap. Once outside, they moved quickly away from the depot, spreading out to avoid presenting a group target if they were spotted. The plan called for them to reach a farm building 2 kilometers away, where they could observe the results of their operation from safety. By 3:15 a.m., all 14 men had reached the observation point. They were exhausted, covered in diesel residue and sweat despite the cold, hands shaking from the sustained adrenaline. But they'd done it. They'd infiltrated a German fuel depot, planted explosive devices throughout, and withdrawn without being discovered. Now they just had to wait 15 minutes to see if the timers worked as designed. 15 minutes until they learned whether Operation Black Knight would go into history as one of the most successful sabotage operations of the war, or as a costly failure that accomplished nothing. Moreau checked his watch. 3:27 a.m., 3 minutes until detonation. He could see the depot in the distance, still lit by its searchlights, still functioning normally, Still unaware of what was about to happen, 28 a.m. 2 minutes, 29 a.m. 1 minute. The men stood in silence, watching. Some prayed, some smoked, some just stared at the depot, waiting to see if their night's work would bear fruit. AM arrived. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Moreau felt his heart sink. Had the timers failed? Had they miscalculated? Had all that risk been for nothing? Then the night exploded into fire. The moment of truth is here. Make sure to like this video and drop a comment about whether you'd have had the courage to attempt this operation. Subscribe for part 2, where we'll see the full devastating impact of what these 14 men accomplished. The first detonation came from the eastern section of the depot. Crawford's plastic explosive charge rupturing one of the main storage tanks. The sound wasn't the Hollywood explosion boom, but something sharper, more violent, a crack that tore through the night air like thunder. The tank split open, releasing thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel that cascaded across the ground in a spreading wave. Then came the phosphorus grenades. One after another, 14 ignition points across the depot activated simultaneously. The white phosphorus ignited instantly upon contact with air, burning at nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite gasoline vapor before the molten phosphorus even touched the liquid fuel. What happened next was beyond anything Moreau and his team had imagined. The fuel didn't just catch fire, it exploded into flame. 5,000 barrels of aviation gasoline, each containing 55 gallons of one of the most flammable substances on Earth, ignited in a cascading series of detonations that turned 3 acres of depot into an inferno. From 2 kilometers away, Moreau and his men watched as a fireball erupted into the sky. Orange and yellow flames shot upward, reaching what looked like 100 meters high, illuminating the countryside like daylight. The heat was so intense that they could feel it on their faces even at this distance. The sound was a continuous roar, fuel igniting, barrels exploding, steel structures collapsing. German guards who had been patrolling the depot ran for their lives. Some made it out. Some didn't. The fire spread faster than any man could run, chasing the fleeing soldiers with walls of flame that turned everything they touched into ash. Within 2 minutes, the entire depot was engulfed. The explosions continued for hours. As each barrel was consumed by fire, the heat caused others nearby to rupture and ignite in a chain reaction. Ammunition stored in an adjacent building detonated, sending tracers and shells flying in random directions. German firefighters from Le Mans arrived but could do nothing except establish a perimeter and let the fire burn itself out. The heat was too intense to approach. There was no saving the depot, only containing the damage to prevent the fire from spreading to the town. 20 miles away, French civilians woke to see an orange glow on the horizon. In Le Mans itself, windows rattled from the continued explosions. German occupation authorities immediately imposed a curfew, flooding the streets with soldiers searching for the saboteurs. But Moreau and his team were already disappearing into the French countryside, splitting up and making their way back to their hidden bases through routes they'd prepared weeks ago. By dawn, when the fires had finally burned themselves out, German assessors arrived to survey the damage. What they found was devastation beyond recovery. Every single barrel of fuel had been destroyed. 5,000 barrels over 250,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, gone. The storage tanks were twisted metal ruins. The rail lines feeding the depot had been damaged by explosions. The guard towers and administrative buildings were charred wreckage. 80% of the aviation fuel stockpiled for Luftwaffe operations in northwestern France had been destroyed in a single night, and the Allies' invasion of Normandy was just 6 weeks away. This is the kind of strategic impact that sabotage operations could achieve. If this story is gripping you, hit that like button and drop a comment about the courage these men showed. And subscribe. We're just getting started on the full impact of what they accomplished. Operation Black Knight at Le Mans wasn't the first major fuel depot sabotage, or the last. To understand the full scope of the Resistance's campaign against German fuel supplies, We need to go back nearly a year to another operation that had helped refine the techniques Moreau's team used. June 1943. Rouen, occupied France. The fuel depot at Rouen was strategically positioned near the Seine River and connected to rail networks that distributed fuel throughout Normandy. British SOE had identified it as a critical target months earlier. Unlike Le Mans, which was a relatively exposed facility, the Rouen depot was integrated into a larger German military complex with Wehrmacht barracks nearby and heavy security. An SOE organizer named Major Thomas Ashford had been working with local resistance cells for over a year, training them in sabotage techniques and coordinating with London on target priorities. Ashford was a career Army officer before the war, had served in France during WWII, and spoke French fluently. He'd parachuted into occupied France in early 1942 with a radio, operator, and instructions to organize resistance. Networks around Rouen, the Rouen operation required even more careful planning than Le Mans would a year later. The team couldn't simply cut through a fence. The depot was inside a compound with multiple layers of security. They needed to obtain detailed plans of the facility, understand guard schedules, and find a way to access the fuel storage area without fighting their way in. The breakthrough came through a French engineer named Claude Rousseau, who worked for the German occupation authorities maintaining rail infrastructure. Rousseau had access to German facilities as part of his job, which meant he could move through secured areas without arousing suspicion. He was also secretly working with the resistance, providing intelligence about German movements and installations. Rousseau's intelligence revealed that the depot office contained blueprints showing the exact layout of fuel storage, including the locations of the main tanks and the rail lines that fed them. More importantly, he learned that guards changed shifts at midnight, creating a brief window when attention was divided and certain areas were temporarily unsupervised. The intelligence gathering phase of these operations was as dangerous as the sabotage itself. If you're fascinated by how resistance networks operated, make sure you're subscribed for more stories about the underground war against occupation. Major Ashford assembled a 5-man team for the Rouen operation. Unlike the larger Le Mans group that would follow a year later, this was a precision strike. Fewer people meant less chance of discovery, but also less margin for error. The team included Ashford himself, 2 resistance fighters with military backgrounds, an expert lockpicker who'd been a professional thief before the war, and who'd offered his skills to the resistance after German soldiers killed his wife, and Claude Rousseau, whose knowledge of the facility was essential. The first phase of the operation occurred on June 12, 1943. The team infiltrated the depot office after midnight, using Rousseau's legitimate access credentials to bypass the initial checkpoint. Once inside, they located the blueprints and spent 30 minutes photographing them with a miniature camera provided by SOE. The photographs would be developed in a hidden darkroom and used to plan the actual sabotage raid. But while they were in the office, Rousseau discovered something even more valuable: guard schedules and patrol routes for the entire facility. This information revealed the specific times and locations where surveillance was weakest, creating opportunities for sabotage that wouldn't have been obvious from external observation alone. The team withdrew without being detected. The photographs were developed and planning for the actual sabotage began. Unlike the Le Mans operation, which used phosphorus grenades and timers, the Rouen raid would rely on plastic explosive, specifically the SOE's Plastic C, a malleable explosive that could be shaped to fit around pipes and structures. Plastic explosive was revolutionary for sabotage operations. Unlike dynamite or other conventional explosives that came in rigid sticks, plastic explosive could be molded like clay to conform to targets. It was stable. You could drop it, shoot it, even set it on fire, and it wouldn't detonate without a Blaze properly placed detonator. And it was extremely powerful. A small amount could destroy structures that would require pounds of dynamite. SOE agents like Ashford were trained extensively in the use of plastic explosive at training schools in England, They learned how to calculate the amount needed for different targets: bridges, rail lines, buildings, fuel tanks. They learned to create improvised detonators from materials available in occupied France. And they learned the critical importance of timing, placing charges correctly so they would cause maximum damage while allowing the saboteurs to escape safely. For the Rouen operation, Ashford's plan focused on the rail lines feeding the fuel depot. Rather than trying to destroy the fuel tanks themselves, which were heavily reinforced, they would destroy the rail spurs that allowed fuel tanker cars to enter the facility, cut off the supply line, and even undamaged storage. Tanks would eventually run empty as German forces consumed the existing stockpile. The raid occurred on the night of June 19, 1943, 1 week after they'd photographed the blueprints. The 5-man team approached the depot during the guard shift change, using the exact timing that Rousseau had obtained from the stolen schedules. They carried approximately 5 kilograms of plastic explosive, shaped into charges prepared in advance and fitted with time-delayed detonators made from clock mechanisms. They moved through the facility using routes identified from the blueprints, staying in blind spots where guard tower searchlights couldn't reach. The rail spurs were located on the eastern side of the depot, partially concealed by storage buildings. The team placed charges at 3 critical points, 2 along the main rail line and 1 at the junction where the spur connected to the larger network. The technical precision of these operations is incredible. If you appreciate this level of tactical detail, give this video a like and let us know in the comments what other sabotage operations you want to hear about. The charges were set with 45-minute delays, enough time for the team to clear the area, but short enough that German forces wouldn't discover them during a routine patrol. At 1:15 a.m., the team withdrew from the depot, again timing their movement to coincide with gaps in the guard patrols. At 2:00 a.m., the plastic explosive detonated. The explosions weren't as dramatic as the massive fire at Le Mans would be a year later. These were focused, precision demolitions designed to destroy infrastructure rather than ignite fuel. But the effect was devastating. All 3 charges detonated successfully. The rail lines were severed, their steel rails twisted and broken. The junction was completely destroyed, creating a crater that would take weeks to repair. The immediate result was that fuel tanker cars arriving at Rouen had no way to offload their contents into the depot's storage system. Trains backed up on the main rail line, creating a logistics nightmare for German transportation officers. The fuel in those tanker cars couldn't be used by aircraft or vehicles. It was trapped in the rail cars, immobile, inaccessible. The longer-term impact was even more significant. Over the following weeks, German engineers worked to repair the damaged rail lines, but the work proceeded slowly. Materials had to be brought in. Specialized rail construction crews had to be diverted from other projects. And security around the depot was massively increased, pulling Wehrmacht personnel away from other defensive duties. In the end, the Rouen sabotage cut off approximately 4,000 tons of fuel transport over a 6-week period. That's fuel that should have gone to panzer divisions, Luftwaffe squadrons, and Wehrmacht logistics units. Instead, it sat in rail cars or was rerouted through other facilities, creating delays and shortages that rippled through German military operations across Normandy. Both the Rouen operation and Operation Black Knight at Le Mans demonstrated the effectiveness of fuel depot sabotage. But they also revealed the techniques and challenges that made these operations possible, and the incredible courage required of the men and women who carried them out. The demolition techniques used in these raids were sophisticated, combining SOE training with resistance ingenuity. The plastic explosive, Plastic C, was manufactured in England and dropped by parachute to resistance cells along with other supplies. Each container of plastic explosive was disguised, often hidden inside false-bottom crates labeled as containing food or medical supplies, in case German patrols intercepted the drop. The detonators were more complex. While SOE provided some ready-made detonators, resistance fighters learned to create improvised versions using materials available in occupied France. A common design used clock mechanisms, small wind-up clocks with their faces removed. A pin would be attached to the clock's minute hand. As the hand moved around the clock face, it would eventually contact a spring-loaded firing pin that would trigger the detonator. This gave the saboteurs precise control over timing. Want the explosive to detonate in 30 minutes? Set the clock mechanism accordingly. Need 2 hours to clear the area? Adjust the clock. The beauty of this system was that it used ordinary objects, clocks, wire, springs, that wouldn't arouse suspicion if found by German searches. The phosphorus grenades used at Le Mans were even more improvised. White phosphorus itself was difficult to obtain. Some came from SOE drops, but resistance chemists also learned to extract it from other sources, including old artillery shells left over from WWII. The phosphorus was stored in sealed glass containers filled with water or oil to prevent it from igniting spontaneously. When the container broke, triggered by the timer mechanism or by impact, the phosphorus would be exposed to air and ignite immediately. These improvised weapons show incredible ingenuity under pressure. Subscribe to see more stories about how resistance fighters created weapons from almost nothing. And share this with anyone who appreciates this level of technical detail. The forged German uniforms and identity papers were another critical element. The Wehrmacht work overalls used at Le Mans were relatively easy to obtain or replicate. They were simple garments without complex insignia. Some were stolen from German laundries or supply depots. Others were sewn by resistance members using fabric that approximated the correct color and weight. The identity papers were more challenging. German military identification included photographs, official stamps, signatures from commanding officers, and serial numbers that supposedly corresponded to central personnel records. Creating convincing forgeries required access to genuine examples to study, talented artists who could replicate the printing and stamps, photographers who could produce appropriate ID photos, and intelligence about how German personnel records were organized. SOE provided some assistance. Documents experts in London had studied, captured, German papers, and created templates that could be used by resistance forgers. But much of the work was done locally by talented individuals who learned the craft through trial and error, knowing that a single mistake could result in discovery and death. The communication methods used by resistance networks were equally sophisticated. Radio communication with London was essential for coordinating operations, requesting supply drops, and reporting results. But radio transmission was dangerous. German direction-finding equipment could locate transmitters if they broadcast for too long. Resistance radio operators learned to transmit in brief bursts, using codes that compressed messages into the shortest possible transmissions. Within France, resistance cells used various methods to communicate without attracting German attention. Dead drops, prearranged locations where messages could be left and retrieved without direct contact between agents, were common. Some groups used seemingly innocent signals, curtains arranged in specific patterns, chalk marks on buildings, newspaper-classified ads with coded messages. One method mentioned in the original intelligence reports was particularly clever: couriers disguised as Romani musicians. The Romani people, though persecuted by the Nazis, maintained networks across Europe and could travel with less scrutiny than some other groups. Resistance networks occasionally used Romani couriers to carry messages and small supplies, with the couriers appearing to be simply traveling musicians moving from town to town. The aftermath of the Le Mans operation revealed the full extent of its impact and the German response. The fire burned for over 18 hours before finally exhausting the fuel that fed it. When German damage assessors finally compiled their reports, the numbers were staggering. 5,127 barrels of aviation fuel completely destroyed, storage capacity reduced by 82%, rail infrastructure damaged, requiring 3 weeks to repair, 4 German soldiers killed in the initial explosions, estimated reconstruction time, 6 months, strategic impact, critical fuel shortage for Luftwaffe operations in the invasion zone. The German response was swift and brutal. Wehrmacht security forces flooded the Le Mans region, conducting house-to-house searches for the saboteurs. The Gestapo arrested dozens of suspected resistance members and sympathizers. Some were interrogated and released. Others disappeared into concentration camps, but the Gestapo never identified the actual saboteurs. Moreau and his team had covered their tracks well. They'd burned the German overalls, buried the wire cutters, and split up to avoid presenting a group target. The Maquis network's cellular structure, where members only knew a few other members, meant that even if someone was captured and tortured, they couldn't betray the entire organization. The Gestapo's failure to catch these saboteurs was as important as the sabotage itself. If this story is keeping you engaged, make sure you like this video and subscribe for more stories about resistance operations that the Nazis couldn't stop. The strategic impact of both the Rouen and Le Mans operations became clear during and after the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. When Allied forces hit the beaches of Normandy, German commanders immediately ordered panzer divisions and Luftwaffe squadrons to rush reinforcements to the invasion zone. But they faced a critical problem: fuel shortages. The months of resistance sabotage, not just at Rouen and Le Mans, but at dozens of other depots, rail lines, and pipelines across France, had created a cumulative effect. German military fuel stocks were significantly depleted. The infrastructure for transporting and distributing fuel was damaged. And critically, the fuel that did exist was often in the wrong locations. Unable to reach the units that needed it because of sabotaged rail lines, Luftwaffe response to the invasion was notably weak. German aircraft that should have been contesting Allied air superiority were grounded by lack of aviation fuel. Panzer divisions that should have counterattacked the beaches within hours were delayed by days because their tanks sat, immobile, waiting for fuel trucks that couldn't get through. Damaged supply lines. Military historians examining the Normandy campaign have noted that German mobility was significantly hampered by logistics problems, particularly fuel shortages. While Allied air superiority and naval gunfire were the dominant factors in the invasion's success, the contribution of resistance, sabotage operations like those at Rouen and Le Mans, was significant and measurable. A post-war assessment by Allied intelligence estimated that resistance fuel depot sabotage delayed German reinforcement of the Normandy sector by an average of 48-72 hours, a critical window that allowed Allied forces to establish beachheads and build up strength before facing major German counterattacks. The assessment concluded, while no single sabotage operation was decisive, the cumulative effect of months of attacks on fuel infrastructure materially contributed to Allied success in establishing and expanding the Normandy lodgment. What happened to the men who carried out these operations? The fates varied, reflecting the dangerous nature of resistance work. Captain Etienne Moreau survived the war. He continued leading his Maquis cell through 1944, participating in multiple additional operations before French and Allied forces liberated his region in August. After the war, he returned to civil engineering, working on reconstruction projects across France. He rarely spoke publicly about his resistance activities, though he did contribute to historical research in the 1970s. He died in 1982 at age 73, having lived long enough to see the France he'd fought for rebuilt and prosperous. Major Thomas Ashford, the SOE agent who led the Rouen operation, was captured by the Gestapo in October 1943, 4 months after his successful raid. He'd been betrayed by a French collaborator who'd infiltrated his network. Ashford was interrogated, tortured, and sent to Mauthausen concentration camp, where he died in March 1945, just weeks before Allied forces liberated the camp. He was posthumously awarded the George Cross for his courage and service. Captain James Crawford and Lieutenant Pierre Beaumont, the 2 SOE agents who participated in Operation Black Knight, both survived. Crawford was extracted to England shortly before D-Day and participated in other operations. Beaumont remained in France and fought with resistance forces during the liberation. Both men continued military careers after the war and remained close friends until Beaumont's death in 1989. These individual stories remind us that behind the statistics and strategic analyses were real people who risked everything. Please share this video to honor their memory and subscribe to ensure these stories continue being told. Of the 12 Maquis fighters who participated in Operation Black Knight, 9 survived the war. 2 were killed in subsequent operations against German forces in summer 1944. 1 was captured and executed by the Germans in July 1944, just weeks before his region was liberated. The survivors returned to civilian life: farmers, mechanics, teachers, ordinary French citizens who'd done extraordinary things and then returned to normal life. The legacy of these operations extends beyond the immediate military impact. They demonstrated that civilian resistance movements, when properly trained and supplied, could strike meaningful blows against occupying forces. They showed that sabotage could achieve strategic effects without requiring the massive resources of conventional military operations. And they proved that courage and ingenuity could overcome significant disadvantages in weapons and numbers. The techniques developed for these fuel depot raids influenced post-war military doctrine. Special operations forces around the world studied the methods used by SOE and the resistance, incorporating lessons about sabotage, infiltration, and guerrilla warfare into their training programs. The improvised explosive devices and timing mechanisms became templates for similar devices used in later conflicts. Modern commemoration of these operations has been mixed. The Rouen raid remains relatively obscure. There's a small plaque near the former depot site, but few people know the story behind it. Operation Black Knight at Le Mans is better remembered. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the raid, French veterans associations held a ceremony at the depot site, which had been rebuilt after the war and continued operating as a fuel facility until the 1980s. A memorial was erected, honoring the resistance fighters and SOE agents who had participated. The site itself is now an industrial park. The depot was demolished decades ago, and modern buildings occupy the land where 5,000 barrels of fuel once burned. But the memorial remains, a simple stone marker with the names of the 14 men who risked their lives that night in April 1944. Local school groups visit occasionally, learning about the raid as part of studying French resistance history. In England, the Special Forces Club in London maintains records of SOE operations, including detailed files on both the Rouen and Le Mans raids. These files, declassified decades after the war, provide the basis for our understanding of how the operations were planned and executed. They include after-action reports, intelligence assessments, and, in some cases, personal accounts from the participants. The Imperial War Museum has artifacts from similar operations: improvised explosive devices, forged German documents, SOE training materials. These physical objects allow visitors to see the actual tools used by resistance fighters and SOE agents, making the historical accounts more tangible and real. If you visit these museums or memorials, you're connecting with a piece of history that shaped the modern world. Subscribe to learn about more places where WWII history is preserved and remembered. Perhaps the most important legacy is the example these operations provide of resistance under occupation. The men who raided fuel depots in 1943 and 1944 weren't professional soldiers for the most part. They were ordinary people who found themselves living under brutal occupation and decided they couldn't accept it passively. They risked torture, execution, and reprisals against their families to fight back in the only ways available to them. Their choice to resist, to take action despite terrible risks, inspired others. Each successful sabotage operation demonstrated that the German occupation wasn't invulnerable, that resistance was possible. This encouraged more people to join the resistance, creating a snowball effect that significantly undermined German control over France. The courage required to walk into a heavily guarded fuel depot, surrounded by barrels of explosives, knowing that discovery meant death. That kind of courage is difficult to comprehend from our safe distance in time. But it's courage that changed history, that contributed to the liberation of France, that helped shorten the war and save countless lives. When Allied soldiers landed on Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, many had no idea that the weak German air response and delayed panzer counterattacks were partly due to fuel shortages created by resistant saboteurs months earlier. The soldiers on the beaches just knew that German resistance, while fierce, wasn't as overwhelming as it might have been. They didn't know about the fire at Le Mans or the destroyed rail lines at Rouen, but those sabotage operations mattered. They saved Allied lives by degrading German military capability at a critical moment. They shortened the war by making D-Day's success more likely, and they proved that civilians with courage and ingenuity could resist even the most powerful military occupation. Captain Etienne Moreau, in one of his rare interviews in the 1970s, was asked whether he considered himself a hero. His response captured the attitude of many resistance fighters. "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We thought of ourselves as French people who couldn't accept what was happening to our country. We did what we had to do. If that makes us heroes, then every person who resisted in small ways, who hid a Jewish child, who sabotaged a German vehicle, who refused to collaborate, they're all heroes too." That perspective, that resistance was duty, not heroism, defined a generation of people who lived under occupation and refused to surrender their humanity to it. The night raiders who sabotaged Hitler's fuel supply were remarkable, but they would have said they were simply doing what was necessary. And perhaps that's the most important lesson, that when faced with injustice and oppression, doing what's necessary, even when it's terrifying, even when the odds are terrible, is what separates those who resist from those who submit. 14 men infiltrated a German fuel depot on an April night in 1944. They planted explosives, withdrew unseen, and watched as months of German fuel stockpiling went up in flames. Their action lasted less than 2 hours but contributed to shortening a war that had consumed the world. That's the power of courage. That's the impact of resistance. That's why these stories matter 80 years later. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of WWII's most daring sabotage operations. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Check out our other videos for more untold stories from the war that shaped the modern world. And leave a comment sharing your thoughts. These operations deserve to be remembered, and discussing them keeps the memory of these brave men and women alive.